It's that time again, everyone. It's time for me to bang the drum about the most useless topic in all of Magic the Gathering that I will still bang the drum on no matter what, because I feel like it's important, and it's important to me. And after all, the most important thing in Magic the Gathering is whatever the hell I think is important. Yeah, don't take that any more literally than it needs to be. That's a joke for, God, I need more friends. Anyway... let's go ahead and talk about interaction in Magic. Now, I've already done a video talking about monocolor interaction you can include in decks, and a video talking about dual color interaction you can add into decks. This next one, though, is going to be about colorless interaction. Stuff that I think that you should be considering putting in your decks right now if you have not already, because these are cards that will make sure that even if your deck has no colors, or if your deck is in a color that struggles with a particular kind of removal, blue struggles keeping permanents off the board in a way that's substantial, black struggles with getting rid of enchantments and artifacts, and red struggles with getting rid of enchantments in general. So if you're in one of these colors that tends to have issues with removal, green struggles with board wipes as well. That's where green struggles. Every single color has some meaningful way of clearing the board of all the bullshit, and green has, like, Ezreal's Predation. So let's go ahead and talk about different kinds of removal you can find in the colorless package, but the rules are going to be a little different. Usually, I try to make sure that all the removal options that I'm selecting are very, very budget-friendly, but there's been a couple shakeups recently that have made it hard to find budget-friendly options specifically for this color, or, you know, lack thereof. Modern Horizons 3 is right about to come out. In fact, by the time you're watching this video, you may actually be at a pre-release right now. So there's a lot of cards with prices in super fluctuation at the moment, and cards that currently have very high utility in formats like Modern are having their prices spiked up because people are, thankfully, a little surprised that Modern might actually see more than 2 people playing in Paper Play. That's a joke again. I just really wish it was easier to find Modern tournaments in my area, and Pioneer tournaments, and literally any standard tournaments. But that's why we talk about Commander so much, because it's one of the few ways I have to enjoy this game anymore. So let's get into what kind of criteria we're looking for removal. We are looking for things that will be able to take a piece of cardboard off of the board, ideally permanently, and allow us to continue with our game plan while impeding somebody else's. So you probably already know exactly where I'm going with this. We have to start talking about Meteor Golem. Yeah, I know everybody is tired of me talking about Meteor Golem, but it's one of the 2 cards I'll bang the drum of forever. Not only in blink decks and reanimation strategies that have access to this card can you abuse it to get rid of cards that you typically would struggle with in budget decks where it's hard to find premier removal in the first place. This is one of the best examples of modular removal you have access to. It can kill anything that is not a land, and that is a very important distinction because we still need cards like Generous Gift to get rid of things like Maze's End and Glacial Chasm, because, you know, those are fun cards that people like playing against. But anywho, Meteor Golem blows up any non-land permanent. It is okay to use in a low-level, low-budget deck as a high-mana way to blow up a card that somebody might be playing as one of their haymakers. Cards like Bolus's Citadel fall into this category for me. Cards like Omniscience, if somebody drops it and they don't have a way to straight-up win the game quite yet, Meteor Golem can get rid of those in decks that, again, typically struggle with that kind of removal. But that's not the only card that I want to talk about that I've banged the drum on forever. The other one is going to be Honored Heirloom. Honored Heirloom is a 3-mana Omni-mana enchantment, which means that for most decks, this can slot in perfectly easily. The people that tell you that 3-mana rocks are bad are just very, very strange to me. The idea that Commander should be this arms race, where we are all trying to put in the most efficient, the most powerful, the most everything spells, is mind-bogglingly bonkers to me. I think decks should be efficient, and I think decks should be powerful, but I don't think that we should be saying that a card that costs just 1 mana more than another one is now somehow useless, despite all the utility it gives over and above something like a talisman. Talismans are good, and signets are good, but cards like Honored Heirloom still have a spot because they are mana rocks that also allow you to remove problematic cards from existence. If somebody is playing a Storm deck that relies on flashing back certain spells, if somebody is playing a Reanimation deck, if somebody is playing any deck that looks at that graveyard at all, a deck that is heavy in cards with Disturb alternate costs, anything like that, Honored Heirloom can help you get rid of them. And you can even do it at instant speed. So if somebody's playing, say, Marin of Clan Nel Toth, as they are about to reanimate a creature, just tap 3 mana and turn that shit off. They're going to be getting 8 to 10 mana of value out of that reanimate every single time, so why not turn it the hell off for the low cost of 8 pennies and 1 slot in your deck? A slot you were going to be including anyway, because let's be 110% honest, you're already putting 8 to 13 mana rocks in your deck anywho. This doesn't hurt you to throw in. It really does not. But that's it for me deviating from there. Let's scroll up in the list. Let's go back to Meteor Golem, and let's go to his second cousin, Duplicant. Duplicant can exile any non-token creature. This means that in colors that struggle with exile removal, like red, Duplicant can give you the ability to get indestructible creatures off the battlefield by, well, exiling them. And again, I don't need to keep on banging the drum that taking a Reanimator player's favorite toy away from them forever is not a war crime. The Geneva Convention will not come for you for doing so. But if you do feel like you want a very easily blinkable card that will get super powerful if you happen to exile something that's big, say from like a dinosaur deck, then Duplicant is your guy. Just know that people sometimes think that he takes the effects of a card for some reason because he's worded kind of like a clone. No, he just takes their stat line and then exiles the card forever. Then we have Cityscape Leveler, a card that's a bit overpriced for what it does, but when you cast it or when it attacks, blow up any non-land permanent. And then its controller makes a Power Stone token, something that most players probably aren't going to be able to make a lot of use of anyway. So you could also, you know, use this to power up a Dockside Extortionist. I'm not saying you should be playing Dockside Extortionist in casual games. I don't think that card belongs there, but Cityscape Leveler is a very, very interesting piece of removal. And like Meteor Golem, it works with Reanimation. You may not be able to get the when you cast this spell ability of the Leveler, but you do get that every time it attacks ability, which means that unlike Meteor Golem, Cityscape Leveler can get rid of 2 cards for the price of 1. Not just because it can ETB and kill a thing if it's been cast and also attack, but also because the longer the leveler's on the field, the longer you have access to easily repeatable removal. So your opponent is going to be incentivized to treat it like a lightning rod and try to zap it off your board, effectively getting rid of one of those cards too. Yes, getting rid of your opponent's removal pieces is important and is a perfectly viable strategy. Devourer of Destiny is another overcosted one that's coming from the Modern Horizons 3 release, so we don't know what the price of this is going to end up looking like, but the Devourer of Destiny says that you've got a pre-game action. You can reveal this card from your opening hand, and if you do at the beginning of your first upkeep, look at the top 4 cards of your library and put one of those back on top of your library and exile the rest. It's a neat effect, but the effect I want to focus on is that when you cast this spell, you can exile any permanent that is 1 or more colors. It's not quite as good as a Meteor Golem as far as I'm concerned, because it doesn't have the ability to get rid of anything, colorless or not, but it does say exile, which is neat. But it is uncast, which is bad, so take your pick. There is one thing that colorless decks do thrive on, and that is getting a surplus of mana, because they have access to some of the strongest mana rocks of all time, being able to just casually drop a Thran Dynamo and then go again without any issue. So I don't think that cards like this that are overcosted will be impossible to play. I just think that it's going to be a neat little cousin to the Meteor Golem as opposed to a straight-up replacement. But in terms of overcosted cards that do jobs that we need them to, let's talk about the introduction to Annihilation. This lets us exile any non-land permanent and make its controller draw a card. This card is costed 1 above the going rate for this in Golgari with no drawback, and 3 above the going rate for this in Golgari with some drawbacks. Assassin's Trophy and Anguished Unmaking being one example, and cards like Atomize and Immortality Spear being another example. But this is a 5-mana sorcery that just exiles anything, and it costs 7 cents, and it has a learn mechanic you'll never use, because again, we're talking about Commander, but I think this is a perfectly reasonable card, and people just kind of forget that it exists. Hell, I forgot that it exists, but I think it's actually pretty decent. If you're playing a mono green deck, actually, this is a really good way to beef up your removal package in those decks, and hell, as I make mono green decks on this channel, this card may actually see a little more play for that very reason. Then we have Selective Obliteration. Each player chooses a color, and then they exile every permanent unless it's colorless or it's the only color that that person chose. So this is a pseudo, kind of not really board wipe that will get rid of certain things on the board. I think it's neat and flavorful, but you're going to have to play it alongside a heavier removal package to make sure that it can get rid of the things that you want. Then we have cards like Null Elemental Blast coming in the new set, and it's an uncommon that people are thinking is $7. So again, I want to reiterate, we have no idea what the price of Modern Horizons 3 cards are actually going to be once a mass wave of them hits the market. But Null Elemental Blast lets us counter a multicolored spell or destroy any multicolored permanent. This is really good since most commanders tend to be multicolored, and this card only costs a single colorless mana. All we have to do is have a spare talisman or a soul ring or something like that available, or a pain land to use one of the colorless producing options of the pain lands. And finally, we have the ability for Null Elemental Blast to slot into most decks. Warping Whale's also interesting because it gives us a counter spell that any deck can use so long as it has colorless mana. This is especially good in monocolor decks that can get away with having a plethora of utility lands and monocolored mana rocks like Worn Power Stone, because then you'll generally always have the waste mana that this wants for its ability. It also lets you exile a creature with power or toughness 1 or less, or create an Eldrazi Scion token. Honestly, most of the time, use this for the counter spell. We have Scour of Existence as well, which can exile a permanent at instant speed. I don't like it as much as the introduction to Annihilation, but it is still very, very good having access to this. And again, in mono green decks that struggle with this kind of removal that's just no holds barred, I get rid of anything, and I've only got 1 copy of Beast Within, it's still a reasonable card. Titan's Presence is also interesting. As an additional cost to this, reveal a colorless creature from your hand, and then exile any creature if its power is less than or equal to that card's power. Honestly, if you are playing this in, say, a green deck or a colorless deck, you're probably going to have some Titanic monstrosity that this will work entirely well for. Then we have Eldrazi's Confluence, which says you can choose the same mode more than once, but you choose 3 like any other Confluence. We can give a creature +3, -3, meaning we can get rid of up to 3 creatures with this. We can exile a non-land permanent, then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, so we've got a neat blink spell here. Or we can create Eldrazi Scions. Let's be honest, we're almost always going to be removing 2 things with this, and then we're going to be blinking 1 thing, and that thing is Meteor Golem. I really like Meteor Golem. Blink Meteor Golem. It creates very fun games. Then we have Kozilek's Command, which lets us choose 2. We can either exile up to X cards from a graveyard, where X is what we pay into it, or we can make a player scry X, then draw a card, usually us. We can exile the creature with mana value X or less, or again, we can just make a bunch of Eldrazi Scions. Let's be honest, the only thing we're going to be doing with this is removing things away and then making sure that at instant speed we're stopping somebody from playing cards from their graveyard. Card's great. I think you should probably take a look at it. I wish that it wasn't sitting at $11, but again, that's Modern Horizons 3 prices. We don't know what that's actually going to end up looking like in the end. But I do have a board wipe I want to talk about as well that I think people tend to forget about when they are building their decks, and they've got, again, this is a green problem, but green struggles with board wiping. Red has access to Chain Reaction, Comet Storm, and Blasphemous Act. White has every single variant of Wrath of God, and then, of course, black has every single variant of Damn. And then when you get to blue, they've got all the Flood of Tears, Cyclonic Rift style cards. And then when you get to green, again, they got Ezreal's Predation. So All Is Dust is a very neat card. For 7 mana, you make every player sacrifice all permanents they control that are 1 or more colors. This means that most of their mana rocks will get spared, but it will get rid of damn near anything else. Card is fantastic, and I can't see a price up there because this is the printing from the new set, and even though the card's been out for a while and it's not super expensive, Modern Horizons 3 ruins everything that we love and hold dear. So here's a board wipe you could be running. Perfectly reasonable, and it will get rid of problem things, because most problematic permanents are not colorless unless you are an Eldrazi player. As a basic one, we can drop down, though, and make sure that you're running these in very specific decks. Don't run these next cards that I'm going to talk about unless you are playing a deck that benefits specifically from a lot of artifacts being on the board, because they are overcosted for what they do and don't give extra benefit outside of that. But Goblin Firebomb, Universal Solvent, and Urn of Godfire are all basically the same card as far as I'm concerned, and they only belong in a few decks. If you've got a deck that benefits from having a lot of artifacts on the board, they are 1-cost artifacts that can be on the board and be removal spells later, letting them serve double duty for you. But if you're not running one of those cards, I would rather run something like, say, Unstable Obelisk, which allows us to have a mana rock that can blow up any permanent if we need it to. If you're playing a budget deck, or if you're a new player that wants to have access to fun cards while making sure that your removal is in other slots so that you technically have access to it, but you're not having to dedicate every single turn to figuring out if you're going to cast one of 5 removal spells in a Niv Mizzet deck, Unstable Obelisk is pretty good, and most players seem to have forgotten that it exists, but I think that it's still worth looking at. Another mana rock that has an interesting purpose is Stone Speaker Crystal. If you're playing a heavy mana deck, this is a Hedron Archive that instead can get rid of any number of graveyards and gives us a draw 1 as opposed to a draw 2. Actually, if I'm being honest, in most decks that you could run a Hedron Archive in, you should probably be running this one as well. And if I had thought about it, I would have probably included this in my Dragon precon that I made recently, because for 9 cents, this doesn't break the budget and it gives access to graveyard removal in colors that sometimes struggle with it, like red. Then we have Spine of Isha, another bastard cousin of the Meteor Golem, but this card actually serves a neat purpose in a couple different decks. I've had 2 decks where I've really liked having Spine of Isha in for a while, and they are Glissa and Liberty Prime. Both of them are artifact decks that want to sacrifice a lot of artifacts to get benefits. Glissa enjoyed Spine far more than Liberty Prime did, though. When it enters the battlefield, blow up any permanent. Very, very simple stuff. It's Meteor Golem without being a creature, but if it's put into a graveyard, we can put it back into our hand as long as it hit the graveyard from the battlefield. That makes the Spine a very high utility card if you happen to be playing a deck that can sink the mana that the Spine wants into it. That's why I liked it in Glissa, because Glissa was in fact a green deck and had lots of spare mana all the time, and Spine triggered Glissa's ability, which was just perfect. Then we've got the Crook of Condemnation, one of the repeatable ways to screw with graveyards. I prefer things like Honored Heirloom to this because I like consolidating my slots as much as possible. I love when cards serve multiple purposes, but a few versions of these are not bad to include in decks that, say, want to commit lots of crimes, which is a very recent mechanic that people have been enjoying a lot, including myself. Predator Flagship used to be included in precons a lot because of its utility, but it can give a creature flying until end of turn or blow up a creature with flying until end of turn. I'll tell you exactly the deck that I would put this in, honestly. I would put this in a Voltron deck. So one of the easy ways to make Voltron decks break parity with people is by granting the Voltron character flying and then hitting somebody in the face for lethal. Oftentimes, if somebody has a blocker, especially if it's like a Baleful Strix that has Death Touch, it can be very hard to actually break parity and not just feel like you're waiting for an opportunity after a board wipe. Predator Flagship, while overcosted, can both give your commander flying and also blow up another creature with flying, which means sometimes that 7 mana just closes out the game for a player. It is heavily costed though, so if you are going to run it, I would recommend you only run it in either colorless big mana Voltron strategies or green Voltron strategies that will have access to big mana anyway. Perilous Vault is another board wipe you have access to. Consider it as a 9 mana board wipe. creates 4 mana and then 5 to exile it and all non-land permanents. This means that even in green decks, you have access to a very powerful board wipe, so long as you're confident you'll be able to rebuild afterwards. For less mana, but sacrificing that for speed, you've obviously got Nevinyrral's Disc, which can blow up all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. This is a very cool card if you're running a Planeswalker strategy, if you're running Super Friends, because Nev's Disc will not blow up those, and it's a great political piece you can hold on to as well. I enjoyed it a lot in Glissa, where it effectively looped itself when I needed it to. But do bear in mind, unless you have a way to untap it built into your deck, this is a very, very slow option. So you're going to have to give it some kind of supplement, which is why it works best in decks that are artifact decks that really want to abuse that untapping effect. Hell, if you've got a Sonic Screwdriver as one of your mana rocks, then Nevinyrral's Disc already has a buddy. Transmogrifying Wand is also interesting, as a 3-mana card that lets us remove one of the 3 charges on it to blow up any creature at sorcery speed and turn it into a 2/4 Ox. Honestly, having a card that basically says, for 4 mana I blow up 1 thing, and for 7 mana I blow up 3 things over the course of 3 turns, I don't think that's a bad rate of removal. And, sorry, not 7 mana, 6 mana. I can't count. Brittle Effigy is also a little interesting in this space, as it is kind of like the Goblin Firebomb Universal Solvent style of cards, but it's a little more manageable, as it's asking for a grand total of 5 mana across however many turns you want to exile a creature by exiling the Brittle Effigy. The only thing I don't like about the Brittle Effigy is that it does exile itself, so I think the best place for this is in heavy budget decks that really need access to that exile and will be willing to grab anything they possibly can to get it. Oblivion Stone is another high mana way of blowing up the entire board, an 8 mana board wipe on its own, but if you want to play the slow game, it can also save one of your permanents as well. If you're playing a green deck though, let's be honest, most of the time you're just going to go and tap 8 mana, cast Oblivion Stone, auto sack it, blow up everything, and then laugh maniacally. Or you put this into a Parry the Pulverizer deck, and you just decided that keeping all of your permanents and making this asymmetric was a really funny way to go about your day. But, you know, I'm not trying to give Parry the Platypus players any actual ideas, but they are the reason I carry a bunch of 3D printed counters in my bag, just in case they happen to be playing that deck and, you know, didn't bring a way to track the counters outside of dice. Anyways, next would be Unlicensed Hearse. This lets you exile 2 cards from a single graveyard, and thankfully its price has been dropping lately. This used to be a $10 card thanks to its utility in Pioneer, but now we actually have access to it in Commander for a reasonable price of $1. Exiling 2 cards constantly from a graveyard is a very good rate of return, and it is, of course, a crime, and I will probably be adding one of these into one of my crime decks anyway, because, hell, why not? More crimes. Then Relic of Progenitus, another way to mess with graveyards. Target player exiles a card of their choice from a graveyard, or we can pay 1 and exile this to exile all graveyards and draw a card to replace it. And that's about it for all of the castable ways we have of blowing up cards on the board in Colorless that I would be using. Obviously, there's more cards like this in the game, but these are the ones that I've selected as a starter area, so that if you are deck building and you're looking for ideas of what to add into your deck, between this, the 2-color, and the 1-color interaction suites, you probably have something that you can use. But there is one aspect of colorless interaction that I've not talked about yet, and that is lands. And oh boy, do we have a fun selection of them. They all do something similar. They either screw with other lands or screw with graveyards, but Ghost Quarter can blow up a land, and I would highly recommend running this over, say, Field of Ruin. Field of Ruin, while included in a couple precons, does have the sad disadvantage of giving 2 players who had nothing to do with the interaction free ramp when you use it. We don't need to be giving players free ramp. They don't deserve it. They did not politic with us. Then we have Volatile Vault, which is another way of blowing up a non-basic land, but it gives us a treasure token to replace itself while giving the person we blew up the land of a basic land. Demolition Field does the same thing, but it gives us us a basic land as well. I like the Demolition Field more than the Volatile Fault, for instance. Then we have Tectonic Edge, which can blow up a non-basic land, and it does not give our opponent a land replacement, nor does it give us a land replacement. And Encroaching Waste does the same thing, blowing up any non-basic land without giving anybody a replacement for a decently high mana cost. But like the Encroaching Waste, it does come into play untapped, so it's not the worst thing in the world. It's not hurting you to have a little colorless mana as long as your deck is built well otherwise. But in terms of getting rid of graveyards, Pit of Offerings is a fantastic choice. This card comes into play tapped, but it does remove 3 target cards from graveyards, and then it is a card that will give us mana for whatever colors of the cards it removed. This is effectively an Exotic Orchard that comes into play tapped that had a really weird steamy one-night stand with a Bojuka Bog. And of course, being able to repeat this effect by bouncing the land is just icing on the cake. And that really kind of does it for most of our colorless interaction. Like I said, obviously there's more colorless interaction in the game, and if you want to get even more expensive, there's probably more options. And I didn't even talk about things like Annihilator, which are technically forms of interaction, but let's be honest, they're a bit more niche because you're probably only running those in Eldrazi decks, whereas most of these can be ran in either colorless decks or monocolor decks that struggle with a particular type of removal generally. Some of these cards are nice and budget and can fit into anybody's deck, and some of these are overcosted because they have a huge bit of hype about them because of Modern Horizons 3. We'll see what ends up happening with all of these, but let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already, and remember, please run more interaction. Please make sure that if your opponent is doing something irresponsible, instead of complaining about it, you're getting rid of it. Insert end of video tagline here.
Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Blitzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Nabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.